G'day again all, it's just Ben again. Just moving on from our introduction to aquaculture stuff before, although it's actually relevant for fisheries management stuff as well. We train a subject related to food safety in both core subjects for both the qualifications, so hence why there's a bit of aquaculture stuff related to it. But moving on from the principles underlying food safety in the seafood industry, we're just going to talk about controlling bacteria growth in particular by methods of cooling. And in this situation, we're going to talk about freezing. Now, freezing itself can be done in many different forms, but depending on how the fish or the target species that we're talking about. So prawns might be frozen differently to barramundi. Barramundi might be frozen differently to oysters, so on and so forth. But first off, we talk about the process of blast freezing, and blast freezing, as the term suggests, is a very quick mechanism to blast cold air over the product that we've got in place and bring the temperature down rather rapidly. Now, blast freezing, obviously, as the slide here suggests, that it blasts cold air across the product, and it works effectively by ensuring that the product is coated in a cloud of frozen air. So we've got to make sure that there's nothing obstructing, obviously, the fan that's blasting the cold air over the product. And it also needs to be a fact that the product is, you're able to get, the cold air is able to get access to the entire product itself. So we need to make sure that there's adequate gaps between your product to allow the air to get around it, and ensure that the door isn't left open or people aren't walking in and out of the freezer too often. Obviously there's risks for the people being in the freezer while it's operating. We don't really want to let anybody get blocked inside. So some of our industry standards would say that there needs to be an adequate alarm system inside to enable someone, say they get jammed inside the door breaks, whatever it might be, that the freezer could be alternatively shut down from outside. Obviously things like PPE need to be included in that process as well, so cold weather equipment, we might say. Now, coming back to the point that freezing product is obviously a way of being able to control our bacterial growth in our product, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's plenty of bacteria out there that will withstand cold temperatures. Some of them are spore-producing bacteria, so on and so forth. Realistically, the process of keeping things cool slows the growth, or what we might even say the enumeration of the bacteria, down to the point where it's practically stable. The higher the temperature gets, the more rapidly the bacterial populations will increase. Now, freezing does that very well, but freezing also modifies the internal water or the internal moisture within inside our product. And typically what happens when we freeze water is it expands. So if we think about putting a water balloon in a freezer, what happens eventually over time, the water expands to the point where the balloon pops. And that's typically what happens on a microscopic scale within our fish when we freeze it. So I don't know if you've ever noticed it before. Fresh fish is quite commonly, well, hopefully, depending on the species, we're looking for a firm flesh fish that isn't too soggy or sloppy. We may freeze that very same product. Depending on how we're frozen, it might change the way that the product acts at the other end when we thaw it out. But typically what happens after we freeze is the fillet or the fish itself becomes soggy and wet. Alright, that's because the internal cell structures of the animals have expanded, they've burst, allowed the moisture out. That moisture is then refreezed inside the structures of the fish, and then when we've thawed it out, we've got this sloppy mess that most of us don't really consider to be very nice. Alright, and that obviously also poses a bacterial problem, because when we open up all these extra little cells, we've then got more area for bacteria to get into and to grow. Alright, so that's a bit of an issue with freezing, and normally freezing would be for obviously supplying big volume customers. Normally that's what we would think. So, on to plate freezers. Plate freezers work really well by putting cold I guess you would think of something like a radiator fluid, I guess, or a refrigerant, through small plates or small thin plates that can get temperatures as cool as minus 30 degrees. Alright, but it needs to make sure, or we need to make sure, that to make it work properly, the fish or the product has to maintain contact, and even contact, as much as possible with the freezing surface. So it's not really good for freezing whole fish, not very good for freezing things like oysters or scallops and so on and so forth. So we kind of normally get to the point where the only thing we would freeze on a plate freezer are whole fillets or portion fillets, so on and so forth. Finally, we've got something that we call immersion freezing. All right, there's a couple of different types of immersion techniques that we do use, but immersion freezing is pretty much a new technique, and I've never actually heard of it being used in anywhere in Australian fisheries, but things may have changed since I last looked. But it works by dipping a product in a cryogenic fluid like something like liquid nitrogen, which freezes down for minus 196 degrees, which is pretty damn cold, and works well if we can separate the animals out quite quickly, or somehow maybe just get them into the freezer, juggle them around a bit, and then immerse them in the freezing fluid. And obviously there on the slide it says it works well for freezing prawns. Alright, I think that's our last slide, which it is. I'm just going to go back. We have another immersion technique that we typically use as well. It is more for fresh product rather than freezing it, and it's called a brine. I don't know how many people have actually ever heard of the word brine, but very quickly spoken, it's a mix of typically salt water or hypersaline water. So normally salt water is around about 33 to 37 grams of salt in about a litre of water. We may elevate that to 40, 50 grams of salt per litre of water, and then add ice. Alright, so what that does is it actually brings the temperature of the water below freezing, but allows the water to stay as water. So we can get to temperatures of minus 1, minus 2, or minus 3. But it typically takes longer to freeze the fish, and we can use it where we want to cool fish down before we freeze them. Typically things like prawns may be added to a brine, and then the product we spoke about earlier, sodium metabisulfite, might be added to that mix as well to help alleviate the fungal problems that occur with prawns and bacterial problems. And from there they may be snap frozen in freezers, so on and so forth, which makes the freezing process a hell of a lot quicker. They may also be used where we want to send fish off to market that have a long way to travel to get back to market. So the boat might be on the water for, I don't know, 10, 20 days, and we don't want to freeze it because the market wants fresh fish. So we might put them into a brine, keep that temperature of that brine at a stable temperature by modifying the amount of water that gets chucked in, the amount of ice that needs to be thrown back in, so that we can keep our fish as close to zero as possible and maintain what we would call a fresh product. So from here, what do we need to do? I guess the big thing that we want you guys to get out of in terms of keeping our fish cool is that it doesn't necessarily kill bacteria. Even at the other end of the scale, above 60 degrees, 70 degrees, 80 degrees, keep going, there is certain types of bacteria that won't be killed by heat. So at the bottom end of the scale, there's types of bacteria that can withstand freezing. Some types of bacteria at the other end can still withstand temperature variations above 100 degrees. So the biggest thing that we want for you guys to think about is that between 4 degrees and 60 degrees is what we would deem the danger zone. Alright, and the most critical point of that is roughly around about our 37.5 degree body temperature, core body temperature, because that's where a lot of the major danger ones like to live, or live and grow. So we've got to keep our fish below 4 degrees, or our seafood products below 4 degrees for the entirety of the seafood chain, alright, or the seafood handling chain. Some people call it the cold chain. Alright, it's a fundamental part of some traceability standards. Some people will monitor that 4 degree mark. Hopefully it stays below 4 degrees or at 4 degrees for the entire period. The minute it starts to creep above 5 degrees, 6 degrees, 10 degrees, the product pretty much violates traceability standards in many situations. So we need to be able to manage that temperature by keeping it below 4 degrees, and that means like having things like temperature alarms on our freezers, able to have more ice on site to top up ice bins if we need to, and other monitoring. You might even have remote monitoring methods so that your cool room's downstairs and you need to be able to monitor it from upstairs. So realistically, freezing, cooling, chilling, whatever you want to call it, is a really efficient way of being able to mitigate risks associated with the food safety problems, particularly related to bacteria. Alright, so if anybody's got any questions about what we've spoken about or you need more info, just flick us an email. Alright, ciao for now.